Okay, everyone, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the symposium session on development of measures to assess systems thinking. I'll serve as the moderator for this session. I'm Dr. K.C. Ejiogu. I'm a team leader and research psychologist at the U.S. Army Research Institute for the Behavioral and Social Sciences, AROI. AROI is a field agency of Army G1. The mission of AROI is to drive scientific innovation to enable the Army to acquire, to develop, to employ, and to retain professional soldiers and enhance personnel readiness. In addition to having a field unit, a research unit that focuses on basic research, AROI has several field units that focus on research in areas like team effectiveness, personnel management, and leader development and training. The presentation in this session is from an ongoing AROI research by the AROI Fort Leavenworth Research Unit, which has as its mission to apply innovative scientific research methods to Army leadership and leader development at organizational and strategic levels to enhance personnel readiness. We have three presenters for this session on development of measures to assess systems thinking. The first presenter is Dr. Avalar. Dr. Lara got her PhD from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Lara is a research psychologist at AROI working on development of complex cognitive skills in Army officers. And before she joined AROI, Dr. Lara worked for over 10 years as a psychology professor at Fort Lewis College in Colorado. The second presenter is Dr. Michelle Weiscarver. Dr. Weiscarver has a PhD in industrial organizational psychology from George Mason University. Dr. Weiscarver has been working on personnel assessment and training research for the Army for over 25 years in a variety of capacities, previously as a research psychologist for the Army and currently as a contractor. Dr. Weiscarver's most recent work has focused on developing individual assessment tools to measure systems thinking, problem solving, and a variety of cognitive constructs relevant for success in the Army. The third presenter is Major Chris Allen. Major Allen is currently retiring from the Army after 25 years of service. Major Allen is working towards his PhD in industrial and organizational psychology. He is interested in how media messages influence the military to civilian transition process between veterans, hiring managers, and volunteer service organizations. So I encourage you all to make time to check out the bios of these three presenters in the symposium information packet if you've not already done so. We'll take questions after the three presenters have completed their presentations. So without any further ado, let me hand over to Dr. Avalar for her presentation.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. We are excited for this opportunity to show you all the systems thinking project that we've been working on here at ARI Fort Leavenworth. So as Dr. Ejiogu said, I'm Dr. Lower, and I shall be taking you through the systems thinking competency model that we have developed. And then Dr. Weiscarver and Major Allen will then show you the two assessment tools that we have been working on. So here are the perspectives that have shaped our systems thinking competency model. So we conceptualize systems thinking as a competency of strategic thinking. In order to be proficient in strategic thinking, we have to be proficient in systems thinking, among other things. Based on prior work in systems thinking, we also see it as something that is multifaceted or having multiple dimensions. And we wanted to identify the behaviors that are indicative of systems thinking. So feedback is an integral aspect of learning. The learner needs to know how well he's doing and what he can do in order to improve. And one way to obtain feedback is through assessments. Our competency model was the basis for two assessment tools. The first one is a multi-rater assessment tool that can be used in a variety of contexts. And the second one is a context-specific assessment tool about Army leader systems thinking with respect to warfighter functions. And then the last part of this project involves evaluating the psychometric properties of the two assessment tools. Right now, we're down here. We are finishing up developing the context-specific assessment tool, and we are moving on to establishing the psychometric properties of the assessment tools. We define systems thinking as a cognitive approach that uses a holistic perspective to identify and understand interrelationships and emergent properties among elements in a complex system. As I mentioned earlier, we see systems thinking as a competency of strategic thinking. Aside from systems thinking, we conceptualize strategic thinking as having 5 other competencies. And they are thinking in time, critical thinking, action learning, innovative thinking, and comprehensive information gathering. In addition, we see strategic thinking as having 4 enablers, namely knowledge, collaboration, communication, and emotion regulation. Strategic thinking enablers help the process of strategic thinking, and they help communicate strategic thinking to others, but they are not necessary to engage in the cognitive process of thinking strategically. If you'd like to learn more about our strategic thinking model, the citation for our report about that is down here. But yes, this talk is about systems thinking. Systems thinking is not just something that is used for strategic thinking. It is relevant to the Army in a lot of other ways. In the educational context, systems thinking supports the objectives of a learning organization by identifying roles and the interdependencies among those roles. At the operational level, leaders need systems thinking in order to make sense of open and dynamic systems when they solve problems and make decisions. At the organizational level, soldiers and leaders who understand their roles and the interdependencies among those roles in a complex organization can also understand team developments and team life cycles. And finally, at the strategic thinking level, leaders need systems thinking in order to understand and anticipate how their decisions can affect different levels of relevant systems. And so this is our process for establishing the systems thinking competency model. We consulted the scholarly literature on systems thinking, and then we interviewed PME instructors, officers assigned to operational units, and also academic SMEs. We used the information we got from the interviews and the literature to draft the competency model, which we then presented to PME instructors and operational officers for their critique. And we revised the model based on their feedback. So systems thinking has been examined by a variety of disciplines and schools of thought, such as systems engineering, soft systems methodologies, and also social networking. All these disciplines agree that systems thinking is important. Systems thinking has been defined in a variety of ways. So it's been characterized as a process for synthesizing viewpoints. It's been characterized as understanding how different parts of a system fit together. It's also been characterized as a set of skills, an approach, or an emergent property. There are commonalities among these different definitions, and here are the 3 emergent themes that we found. The first one is that systems thinking is cognitive in nature, and that involves cognitive skills that are related to thinking and understanding. The second one is that systems thinking involves looking at the whole of a situation or getting the larger picture. And the third one is that systems thinking involves understanding how different parts are connected or related. So these emergent themes all went into our definition of systems thinking. For our interviews, we spoke to 35 officers assigned to operational units. We call them operational participants for short. And then we also spoke with 23 officer and civilian instructors who were assigned to training units or leader development. Their ranks range from captain to colonel, and their time in service ranged from 4 years to 30 years. 66% of them had masters or doctorates, 5% had professional degrees, and 29% had bachelor's degrees. The participants hailed from 15 different MOSs, with most of them coming from MOSs associated with combat arms. So this is what we found. There's a lot, so let me unpack those. The first one is that most participants are familiar with the general concept of systems thinking. For operational officers, their knowledge of systems thinking involved discussing specific types of systems and also military processes, while for institutional participants, their knowledge of systems thinking involved discussing various ways of thinking and systems thinking as a perspective. Most participants saw systems thinking as something that develops over time. However, there were some participants who pointed out it depends on the individual. An individual needs to be open to introspecting and to learning about systems before they can develop as systems thinkers. There are differences among novice, intermediate, and expert level systems thinkers, according to the participants. And these are organized along 4 different categories. There's system-specific knowledge, system general knowledge, depth of processing, and communicating with and mentoring others. So system-specific knowledge is pretty straightforward. This is the information that about systems that you work with as part of your job. System general knowledge involves knowing about like systems thinking methodologies, approaches, and theories. According to most participants, it's something that increases with experience, but that it's also needed in high levels in order for an individual to advance as a systems thinker. For depth of processing, novices have been known to address issues at a surface level, and they also tend to accomplish narrowly scoped tasks with little regard for the potential side effects. Whereas you have intermediate systems thinkers who are open to alternative perspectives and new information, and also questioning their own assumptions. And the thing is, at times, they don't really assess the outcome or the impact of the solutions that they adopt. And then you have expert level systems thinkers who, when they get new information, they update their knowledge of systems accordingly. They are also comfortable with ambiguity. The thing with experts is that they know to assess the solutions to issues, but they also think ahead. What would the new developments that those new solutions would lead to, and what issues would those new developments bring up? For communicating with and mentoring others, communicating with and mentoring others involves sharing information, conveying different perspectives, and also asking questions to get to the root of a problem. So what participants said is that expert systems thinkers tend to mentor their staff so that everybody has a shared understanding of the systems that they work with. In addition, expert systems thinkers are familiar enough to work with the Army social system so that they know how to manage and work with the existing structures within that system and also with the individuals within that system. And participants did say that they do use systems thinking on the job to operate and maintain systems, such as working with the time and resource factors involved in various companies in the battalion, and also to work within specific systems, such as social systems, personnel systems, and training exercises. Most participants said that they do think that systems thinking is something that should be developed at all levels, that lieutenants should start learning about systems terms and also relevant subsystems. But we did have quite a few participants who said that they think systems thinking is something that doesn't need to be developed until a leader gets to a higher rank. Participants named several benefits of engaging in systems thinking. The most prevalent benefits named is that it improves information flow within units, it also increases organizational adaptability. So again, we took what we learned from the literature and what we learned from our participants, and we used them to draft our competency model. We presented that draft to PME instructors and operational officers. They critiqued it, and we revised the draft based on their feedback. So here is the competency model. So we see systems thinking as having 5 different dimensions. The first one is identifying elements. Then you have understanding dynamic relationships, shifting perspectives, identifying holistic patterns, and responding to change. So identifying elements involves being able to name and describe the people, objects, and concepts in an environment that come together to form a whole. And then you have understanding relationships, which conceptualizes the nonlinear, bidirectional, and changing relationships among those elements that form a whole. Shifting perspectives is understanding how the subordinate and superordinate levels of a system are related. And it also involves being able to shift from one level to another as needed. And then you have identifying holistic patterns, which is being able to understand the larger picture and also being able to identify common systemic patterns. And then finally, there's responding to change, which means that the systems thinker is open to new information and different points of view when they are examining how elements are related. In addition, this involves having a flexible and fluid concept of the boundary that encompasses a system. So anyway, that's our competency model. I shall now turn things over to Dr. Weiss-Carver and Major Allen.
We have a couple of questions online, so maybe we take them now before we go to the to Michelle. Actually, one of the questions says, do you see that there are thinking styles that are more conducive to effective systems thinking? Is a divergent thinker more agile in systems thinking than assimilating? Or are all thinkers just as capable as any other?
There are definitely thinking styles that may contribute more to the development of systems thinking as opposed to others. As to naming those systems, those thinking styles, definitely like openness to ambiguity is one of them. It seems like based on what we have seen, divergent thinking is another one that can contribute to an individual improving as a systems thinker.
Yeah, I want to mention the name of the person who asked the previous question. Okay, by the way, that question was asked by Mike Nupper at MSCOE.
Okay.
So the second question, this one is from John Harrington, CAC. Do we teach systems thinking in PMEs? That's OES, WOES, NCOES, and pre-command programs. Should we?
Systems thinking is taught. So when we spoke to PME instructors, that's one of the things that we asked. And so there's not a lot of courses out there that explicitly develop systems thinking. SAMS would be one of them. Like courses such as the ones in CGSC, their material gets at systems thinking if they don't necessarily explicitly talk about developing systems thinking, and that the students do need to engage in systems thinking in order to successfully complete their course requirements. And then at War College, definitely, they do teach systems thinking.
And the last question is by Mike Nupper, MSCOE. Is a systems thinker different than a strategic thinker? And by the way, this question, Dr. Brandon Woody, who is at Fort Leavenworth ARI, also tried to address, to respond to Mike, but go ahead and respond.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, that's something that has come up for us. And when we interviewed our SMEs, for example, we're like, so what do you think about the relationship between systems thinking and strategic thinking? So the way that we see it is that systems thinking is part of strategic thinking. So if you're a good systems thinker, you may be a good strategic thinker, but that also depends on how well you do on the other 5 competencies. However, we have come across SMEs who said that you have systems thinking, and under systems thinking is strategic thinking, which would suggest that if you're good at systems thinking, you're most likely good at strategic thinking. And then there's also how is systems thinking related to critical thinking, which is a whole nother like bag.
Okay, so let's go to Dr. Weiscarver.
Okay.
Okay, great. Is this on? Okay. So before we move on from this one, I just want to emphasize this is the foundation for the assessment. So anytime you develop an assessment, there's a couple key questions. And one is, what am I going to assess? So clearly here we're going to assess systems thinking. And you have to start with that as your foundation. And if you recall, sometimes folks develop assessments and they define the construct they're going to assess. So I'll go back and I'll read the definition so you can imagine developing an assessment based on that. So systems thinking is a cognitive approach that applies a holistic perspective to identify and understand interrelationships and emergent properties among elements of complex systems. That's a huge mouthful, right? And you're like, okay, what are we doing? And now we're going to develop an assessment from that. That's why we go through the whole process that Ava talked about. Okay, we need to talk to people. We need to figure out what are these behaviors, what's involved in this, what is systems thinking? And we can have a definition like the one I read, but that only gets you so far. It's like a concept. And then it's like we need to move it to reality. We need to move it to more specifics. And we need to identify behaviors that we can kind of hang our hat on in order to assess some of these things. So that's what this does for us. And these 5 dimensions and the behaviors that are listed in defining each of those dimensions set the foundation for any assessment that we were going to develop in this area for systems thinking. So that sets the foundation for both of the assessments that Ava indicated that we would be talking about. So that's one of the questions is what are we assessing? Then another question is, what's the purpose of my assessment? And that we talk about assessments and it kind of seems like we're just talking about one thing, but that's like talking about vehicle, like it's an assessment is a vehicle to accomplish something, to gain some information. And so if you think about vehicles, you know, if you said, hey, I'm going to move my dresser, you know, can I borrow your vehicle? And somebody gives you a VW or a Corvette or something, and you're trying to move your dresser, it's not going to accomplish what you want to do. So you really have to say, what are we trying to accomplish with this assessment? And in this case, for both of these assessments, we were focused on training and development and providing feedback. And so this one, this specifically focuses on the multi-rater assessment. So that's the first one we'll talk about. But the purpose for both was to provide, you know, it was for training and development and to provide feedback. Another question that's important to think about is, you know, what are the kind of situational factors, the parameters, or any constraints that you have to work within. So a lot of times you'll have, when you're developing an assessment, constraints like time. Somebody will say, well, I'll give you 10 minutes. You got to assess this in 10 minutes. Or do you have a couple hours? Or do you have a couple days? So that's a factor. One of the constraints in this is that they wanted the multi-rater assessment to be one tool that would be appropriate across levels and across contexts, so different branches and that type of thing. So that's really an important constraint or parameter because you're going to have one set of questions that's appropriate kind of cradle to grave, so to speak. So it's another important thing to think about. Another factor about this, even though it's a multi-rater assessment, it can be used, you know, just by one rater or multiple. So you'll see on the, so that's the tool itself. And again, this is a question that could go to anyone at any level. Now, when you read the question at the top, so how proficient is this leader in identifying all of these elements, et cetera, you can read the question and say, well, I don't even know how I would answer that. That's why you have all the behavioral indicators in the boxes below. So those behavioral indicators are what's really supposed to help you figure out, you know, where a leader, where yourself or a leader that you're assessing, you know, it would be rated. So those boxes, if you take a look at the first one on the left there, this leader struggles to describe or discuss elements of systems routinely encountered at their echelon. That is key right there. The end of that phrase, routinely encountered at their echelon, is the specific phrase that enables you to use the same form at any level. So the person who's making the rating has to understand the systems that are routinely encountered by, say, a captain or by a major or by a colonel in order to make this rating. And that's a potential drawback of this. So the plus of using this type of form that has one question that can go kind of cradle to grave is that it's simple, right? There's one form, anybody could use it. A drawback is that it's general. You have to keep it general in order for it to be able to be used across the different levels. So again, it gets back to what's your purpose, what's your vehicle, what are your constraints. And so this, accomplishes certain things. There's certain, benefits to this type of approach. And then there are certain limitations or constraints for this. Again, the assessment measures each of the 5 dimensions. So this is an example of the question for elements. There's a page, one question for each of the dimensions. And this just being one example. So in making your ratings, the idea with the boxes, the behavioral examples underneath each rating box is not that an individual would have to check all of those boxes. They're what we call formative. They're not reflective. So they don't need to meet every single box. The idea is, hey, if they meet some of these boxes, if you've seen these behaviors from this individual, then they're most likely in this domain, in this area. And again, the purpose of this is to be able to provide some feedback to soldiers. This is for training and development. And so you can see where you'd have very specific examples of things that weren't going well or things that were going well for this person. And then the boxes on the very bottom are places where you could indicate specific examples of times when you were observing this person. I mean, you might not use those for yourself, but you could. But so if it was an instructor using this form, they could indicate certain exercise, where an individual was demonstrating certain behaviors and provide some, in this thus and such exercise, this is what we saw. So again, anybody could use this at any level. There's one question for each. This shows just the one example, and it has certain benefits. Again, it's simple. It can be used by anyone at any level, and so that's what we were kind of aiming for with this particular assessment. Once somebody fills those out, this is just a roll-up sheet. So, add all of the ratings within a category and average them, and then sum them up. There's, ways to sum by dimensions. There's ways to sum by type of rater. And you could do any combination of these, and it could work. And again, this is self-rated, so obviously when you're rating yourself, this is for development purposes, and we're thinking, self-development would be a great place to use this, or in a course. You're dependent on the individual being honest. This isn't for selection for promotion or hiring type thing. This is for self-development. So you can be honest and, really kind of help yourself out and understand where you might want to develop. Or you could, kind of lie to yourself and not answer the questions, honestly, and make yourself look great, and all you do is hurt yourself. But so this is self-rated, but again, there's reasons for, developing it in this manner. This just provides a roll up on this slide, so you can roll the scores up by rater on the left side there, or you can roll the scores up by dimension, as you can see on the right side. Now, as Ava indicated, there's not data yet on this. That's the piece that's coming next. So collecting data with this and looking at validation results, psychometric aspects of this, and seeing how well it works and how useful it is for people. We could do questions on this, if there are questions on this before we move to the next one.
Yes, we have a couple of questions. One of the questions is from Todd Chamberlain. This is a fairly long question, so I'll just take some time to read it. And it says, did the current research use insights gained about systems effectiveness traits identified from the work of General Starry's Systems Doctrine Office, its Task Force Delta, and AROI's research in the late 1970s to 1980s on the application of James Miller's living systems theory and Olmsted's research into factors of organizational effectiveness, FORGE. So basically, it's asking about the background, whether in designing this, whether you took into consideration all these other things that the questioner listed.
So as Ava talked about in the very beginning, that was part of the development of the model. So look, we looked at, as Ava talked about, we looked at the general literature that's out there on systems thinking, of which there's quite a bit. And there's also military-specific literature on systems thinking. And so there's quite a bit, quite a few studies out of Army War College. There's some papers out of CGSC. And then, of course, a huge body of literature. What I would say about the literature on systems thinking, which was interesting for us as we got into it, is it's mainly conceptual. In nature, it's not empirical in nature. So there's really very little, almost none, no research, empirical research on systems thinking kind of prior to this. It's mainly conceptual. And so what happens is you have a lot of ideas that are floating out there, of which these would be examples. And there's not much empirical data to indicate one clear direction that it should take as you move forward.
Okay, the next question is from Dr. Eric Randall. And the question is, has the assessment been validated and shown to be reliable? How is it deployed to unit leaders for assessing command teams?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and you may have written that right before I said the part about we're still going to assess it or validate this. Think about this though, when you think about validation of this, the validation for a tool for development, training and development purposes for feedback, and a lot of this might be self evaluation. The validation of that is very different than the validation of a test for selection or promotion. So, for instance, when you think about reliability, the question is going to be, well, in what way do I want it to be reliable? So there's various, you can say internal consistency is one measure of reliability. Well, if you think back to the behavioral, well, I can pull those back up. But if you look at the behavioral examples here, again, they're formative, they're not reflective. So you're not going to do a coefficient alpha. You're not going to ask somebody to rate all of those things. You also wouldn't ask them to rate the first dimension, second, third, fourth, fifth, and expect those to be reliable. because they're formative. They're different aspects. They form systems thinking. They don't reflect systems thinking. So a coefficient alpha would not necessarily be appropriate. There's other types of reliability. So test retest. Would you expect that to be reliable or not? I mean, so they're good, very good questions, but the answer is not going to be easy. So you don't necessarily expect, if somebody's developing over time, that they would consistently rate in the same place. So then you wouldn't have test retest reliability. Yeah.
So as you go into the validation, I guess, is there an aspect to where you're going to have some context about the different raters of a person? Because when I look at that scoring sheet and it has like peer and subordinate, right, and I just think of myself, like how many of my peers and especially my subordinates are privy to my thought process on a regular enough basis that they could actually answer some of these questions and it be a valid assessment, right? Because I mean, there might be a small group who see how you kind of think and work on a consistent basis, but it may not be 6 of them. I mean, I saw this. I don't know if that's required to have 6 of each one. I know it's up there, but you know, the group that actually might be able to observe these behaviors that you're asking about is probably relatively small, at least in my circle. Maybe I just don't know a lot of people or don't work with a lot of people, but I would think for most leaders, especially the more senior you are, like sometimes the more senior you are and you're supposed to be the strategic systems thinker, like there aren't as many people who are really in that inner circle to see those behaviors. So I was just curious how you're going to approach that.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And I mean, I think you really need to think about that. And I mean, I have all along, you know, been like, do you really put subordinates in there? Because they shouldn't really understand, you know, the systems at your level.
Where they may not have the whole context.
Right.
So
right. But there's nothing about this that is mandated. It's again a self-development tool, and looking through it and trying to help yourself understand. Okay, you know, for somebody who hasn't really looked into systems thinking before or tried to develop it, it's like, okay, what are the elements? What is it that I should be, not elements, but what are the components of systems thinking? What should I be thinking about? You know, what should I be developing? And all of this is part of a research product, a handbook type of product, where it gives you some background on systems thinking, like, okay, let's think about systems thinking. And again, it's not easy, and there's many different ways of looking at it, even within the Army. West Point has its own, approach. But, let's start thinking about systems thinking and understanding what it is, and then rather than just having something that they can read, they can look at this and start saying, okay, let's reflect on my own development, and let me think about where I am on this, and then let's roll that up and see if I feel like there are certain things where it's a shortcoming, and maybe you ask your supervisor to also fill one out. Again, I think instructor is a great place, in a training setting, because the instructor, if they have the right exercises, should have a really great insight into, a nice window into your systems thinking. I think that is one of the best, places where this could be used. So you and an instructor or multiple instructors providing you with feedback. But I think you're exactly right. You really have to think about that, because are your peers going to have insight into that? Maybe, maybe not. It depends, like, the situation that you're in. And subordinate's really a question mark there. Yeah.
I was wondering, have you considered possibly doing a replication study or a validation study at the Warrant Officer Career College? I think a different cohort regarding who to sample would be very beneficial, because by definition, the warrant officer is sort of a single point of contact or individual that's responsible for integrating the Army's larger technical-oriented systems. And even more interesting, given that we have in-house at certain points during the year not just candidates, and we would love to consider, okay, what does an entry-level candidate look like and score as regarding systems thinking compared to somebody mid-tour who has had an opportunity to grow and get a deeper appreciation for organizational dynamics and interrelationships and things of that nature, because we do teach a class on systems thinking at the ILE level, which we are starting to look at pushing down toward the candidate level, because we realize that they have to be capable of identifying such things earlier on.
Mhm.
So I would love to offer up myself as a point of contact. I'm one of the research chairs over there, and establishing something like that, because there's a lot of value in this for us. I mean, and we're such a small little contingent. We represent like 2.5% of the total force across all compos. So yeah, I would love to talk more about
Yes,
that.
that would be awesome. Yes, I will be following up with you.
Yeah, that's great.
And just quickly along those lines, there are two comments, not questions, two comments online. I just wanted to highlight them. One is from John Harrington, CAC, QAO, and he was referring to a previous session, and he said, I like your masked format. It may be useful in designing a new DF form 1059. So it's just a comment that he likes the masked format.
Great. Thank you, John.
The second comment is from Dr. Eric Randall, and he said he loosely worked with Dr. Anna Sackett as he developed a systems thinking instrument based upon Anna's ARI 2016 report. So Dr. Harrington finds this presentation quite interesting. He said, though, he did not validate his instrument, but so it's just a comment. Over.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. That's great information to have. Thank you. Well, we will move along to the next one. So, so again, each assessment can serve different purposes, and ARI actually at this point has 4 assessments for systems thinking because they have different purposes, and we're just talking about 2 of them today. So this one's a context-based systems thinking assessment. And the idea here is, with the last one, anybody could answer that from any branch at any point in their career. But the reality is, and this is, they're both direct assessments, really, and we just heard Dr. Kim talk about the importance of direct assessments. They're both direct, and yet there's different ways in the behavioral sciences, right, to assess something. You can ask somebody about their behaviors. So we defined all those behaviors that are important for systems thinking. And you can say, hey, how often do you do that, right? That's really what the 360 is doing. It's saying, how often do you do that? Or rating how often somebody else thinks you do that. We try to make those behavioral, although it is something that happens in your head, right? So how behavioral can it be? But that's why in the previous one we used, are they describing and discussing these types of things? So in meetings or in whatever. But if you, and you could do the same thing, if you think about physical fitness, you could assess physical fitness and assess how many pull-ups somebody could do by saying how many pull-ups can you do, right? And then they're going to self-assess, self-rate, or you can ask them to do the pull-ups. So, and that's the difference between our 2. In the first one, we ask, hey, how often do you do this? And they're going to answer it. And then in this one, in the context-based systems thinking assessment, we actually ask them to do some systems thinking. So using a scenario-based tool. And the plus of that is you're asking them to actually do it. So they can't just make something up or, think they're all great and, say that they are, but maybe they're not. The negative is there's so many systems in the Army and so many systems at different levels that you clearly can't use it across different situations. So this is specific to one group of people at a certain level, that type of thing, because there's so many different systems that people would need to work with. So this we worked with Mission Command Training Program to look at, as Ava mentioned earlier, the warfighting functions. So thinking about the warfighting functions as a system. So folks that would work like in the COIC staff officers need to understand those warfighting functions and how they work together and the impacts of one thing on another and that type of thing. So clearly this is not an assessment that you would give to a lieutenant, right? And it would probably be way too easy for a general officer. So that type of thing. We are focused in on majors as a staff officers and at the major level for this. So we developed a scenario to try to put in a bunch of systems in there. Again, the warfighting functions as a system in there, and then ask questions about the scenario in order to gauge whether they're taking all the various elements of the system into consideration in their answers. And so we worked with, as I said, MCTP and Major Allen, recently retired, was the one that helped us to create the scenario and the questions. And so he's going to talk a bit about the scenario itself and then what test takers need to do as they're going through the assessment.
All right, thanks, Michelle, for handing that off. We'll just stay on this slide real quickly. So just what MCTP is, just before we kind of go down this path. Mission Command Training Program, as it says there, but what's unique about MCTP is that it trains corps and division and sometimes brigade staffs, in a warfighter scenario using a LISCO environment. So what's unique about it is that MCTP will generate a scenario. Most of them are on the classified side. This scenario that we used specifically for this C-State development was actually done on the unclassified side like a few years ago, which was unique to this. And the European Theater of Operations, and kind of what the slide says there, it involves 3 different U.S. divisions and 2 partner force divisions that are in Europe now. So we developed these scenario-based exercises to train the staff. And obviously, like in military units, each staff operates off of the commander's intent and what the commander wants to do and the commander's training objectives. So that is sort of the context with how MCTP operates. Next slide, please. Okay, so the C-Stay, so how we get to elements and measuring these elements through questions is we have maps, objectives, multiple situation updates, and consisting of, like it says there, 38 questions with multiple subparts. Now, each of these questions answer elements that we've kind of discussed about, already. Next slide, please. Areas assessed, we recognize elements of a given situation, really determining warfighter function relationship. So with MCTP is unique. You'll have through the assignment cycle, you'll have maybe 20 or 30 OCTs come in every year. Each of these OCTs, may or may not know much about aviation, and they're an armor officer or intelligence officer, but we expect them to be kind of a jack of all trades, when they're OCTs and coming to discuss things with the unit and train. Let's see, so we want them to understand warfighting function systems as a whole, and they need to be able to consider the impact that situation changes have on an exercise. So next slide, please. So right here is an example of a situation update, and I believe in the exercise that we put together for folks to take, I believe there's about 8 situation updates. What's missing here is before each situation update, we will have a map. So there's a map up there. We did not include the map intentionally, just for purposes. We just we didn't want to do that for security purposes and just things like that. So a test taker will have a map They'll have some commander's intent at the sleeve-hook level, and that's the only intent we give them at the beginning. So as they progress down this test, they'll answer these questions, circle one, some are forced choice, some are not. What's interesting about the C-state is that these are not right or wrong answers. So there is debate among test takers as to what the right answer is. And so we'll kind of go into why that matters at some point later. Next slide, please.
That's pretty much it.
Is it?
Yeah.
All right, I'm fast.
Because we're still in progress with this. And if there's anybody out there who's interested in this assessment, we're always looking for folks who are interested in reviewing it and kind of giving us feedback on it. This is, again, it's not exactly what would be in there, but it gives you an example. So this particular question would be getting towards the elements. So it gives you this situation update, and the first thing that it asks is, about the configuration of the COIC. So it's kind of like, there, I guess, folks that go in there and they set up their COIC, and they're people that aren't even there, that should be there that aren't there, and they can't even easily coordinate with them. So it seemed like an easy way to ask. There are other element type questions about who are you including in certain meetings, what are the L&O relationships that you need to have. So there are various ways to ask about elements. These have this kind of yes/no format, but the other 4 dimensions are all like a 1 to 5 Likert scale of you're presented with a certain decision, a situation, certain decisions that are being made, and how likely is that to be effective. The right answer is rated based on SME response. So we'll have MCTP SMEs, rate the correct response, and then test takers' responses will be assessed vis-a-vis those rater responses. But anybody who would be interested in taking a look at this or working with us on this, again, it's still in progress. So we're working towards, finalizing the content and the questions, and then finalizing the right answers. And then we'll be taking, collecting some data. And there could be multiple applications of this. I know we're getting close to being out of time, but I think we have a little bit of time to talk about applications.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if we were going to have time.
Yeah, and just Michelle, quickly, you talked about anybody who might be interested in taking a look at this. There's a comment and an offer online. Dr. Eric Randall, he said he would be interested in assisting in the development or testing of any of the 4 assessments.
Great. Awesome. That's excellent. Yeah, that's great. Do you have his contact info?
We'll ask
Great.
We'll ask him
Thank you.
I can address those 2 C-state things. So yeah, so 3 things about the C-state that I wasn't sure if I'd have time to cover or not. So yes, we've had 1 SME panel already, where we kind of, like a shot group, we've kind of tightened things up with regards to how we're asking the questions, and had some great feedback, and we've already incorporated that into the current C-state version. But 2 uses that I envision, this is just Chris Allen, how I envision MCTP using the C-state, is first with onboarding. Once we have it down, again, so I talked about earlier, so MCTP probably gets about, 20 to 30 new OCT divisions soldiers across the board every year. These folks have different MOSs, varying degrees of experience, and so MCTP has an OCT academy that, brings standardize these people to go out into the force and into warfighter situations and to be OCTs. One thing that this C-state can do is help, in a group, folks come in, take the C-state, and then it's like, okay, we realize that, here's an element where, he or she may or may need some work on. If we're smart about it, we can adjust the OCT onboarding, classes appropriately based off what we find in the C-state data. Second thing is MCTP operates off of what's called an exercise life cycle. So 5 times a year, they'll have warfighters that MCTP will go out and train divisions or corps. It is possible that once CSTE is fully developed, that at the beginning of the exercise life cycle, we may be able to give it to the staff officers at echelon and sort of, pre, mid, and post-test model to see if there is progress during the ELK cycle, and are we getting at what we need to get at during the ELK cycle, as far as what the Army wants us to do, TRADOC and MCTP. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, so we just have enough time. Ava will finish it.
Yeah. So in terms of where we are, as I mentioned, we're moving on to establishing the psychometric properties of the 2 assessment tools. We have a technical report about the systems thinking competency model. So it's going through our ARI leadership right now, and then we hope to be able to publish it in DTIC soon. We also have a research product that documents MAST, and it's also being reviewed. And we also have hope that it will be publicly available soon. And I already mentioned the testing. And we are continuing to revise CSTE based on SME feedback. And we hope to be able to move on to data collection with that one pretty soon also. So anyway, again, my co-presenters are Dr. Weiss-Carver and Major Chris Allen. And Dr. Weiss-Carver is the head of this team, consisting of Chelsea Beard, Cara Adis, and Leah Engelstead. Anyway, any more questions?
No more questions online.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wrong place for you to see me. Yes. What I'm wondering is going back all the way back to where you discussed the interviews that built up your original model. And you mentioned you could characterize people who were novices, intermediate, and expert. As you described, I mean, you could even go back to the set of competencies. This is a very complicated ability consisting of multiple complicated abilities. So I guess what I'm wondering is how many people, when you're just sampling people to interview, for example, were experts at this? Did you have a sense of how common that is? I guess I would start with the bias that it is rare to really be an expert systems thinker. And how far do you think having this as a developmental tool can push people towards this, an ability which just in the general population might be quite rarefied?
Yeah. You want to take this one?
Well, yeah, that's a lot of great questions packed into that. Yeah, how many experts did we talk to? Here's the funny thing is, we're trying to develop an assessment for systems thinking. And so in order to know if they were experts, you'd probably have to have an assessment for systems thinking, which we don't have. So it's, systems thinking is a really hard field because there's not a lot. We have trouble with the validation piece because it's like, well, there's not really criteria. What I think you end up having with systems thinking is a lot of experts in a field, right? And so they have to have a whole base of knowledge in something in order to think about systems, and then they have to have certain skills, as well, thinking skills, and you're bringing all of that together. And so, to the question of how many experts did we talk to, I think, what we tried to do was get folks who, hey, if they're not an expert, who is, because they're the senior level instructors, they have 30 years of experience.
I can talk to that. So with regard to the CSTE specifically, our SME panel, what we did was we went across MCTP and said, look, who are these senior majors and lieutenant colonels that our battalion command select or our war college, type folks, SAMS type folks to be our SME. So it's kind of contextual, your question, or the answer to your question. So that's what we did for our SME panel. And so over time, we'll get more responses from other SMEs, and we'll start to establish trends with regard to these dimensions. And so, again, just like shot grouping, we'll start to narrow in what right looks like. So it's not necessarily a yes or no. It's, how far apart, is a test taker from the trend that's been established from the SMEs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. And I guess you're building on Dr. Weiss-Carver's comment that this is such a difficult thing to validate because of its complexity, because when you're going to experts who, if they don't know how to do systems thinking, who does? I can understand that logic. It feels like it's also complicated by the possibility that this is such a complex set of interlocking cognitive abilities. There's even a question of whether the experts have that insight to tell you about what they're doing when they're doing successful systems thinking. Clearly, you can ask them questions about a system that they know about and what they would consider. But it sounds like from a lot of these things, like the ability to understand and integrate dynamic relationships and identify holistic patterns, you know, how much insight would even an expert at doing that have on to be able to help you develop a metric of it? I can see it. I'm talking myself in circles here, but it does sound like a very complicated thing to get a handle on.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I mean, it is, you know, you have to start somewhere. And you know, as Ava indicated, we started with, okay, what's in the literature, of which, again, there's a lot. However, it's mainly conceptual. It's not empirical. So even when you go to the literature and experts and folks have written books and, you know, et cetera, do they really know? I mean, they're talking to concepts, you know, it's not been proven, you know, so it's a hard area, and it's kind of one of those things where, okay, you know, you have to dive in and you have to start somewhere, and then you have to keep open. You have to keep your mind open to, you know, a lot of different possibilities and looking at different things, so that you don't think to yourself, oh, you know, I solved this problem right from the beginning. You know, so we need to be flexible about this as we go through this process and learn more about it. And yeah, so I agree with you. It's just a really hard area.
Okay, I think we're out of time. So with that, we'll formally end the session. The presenters, I'm sure, will hang around for a couple more minutes because the next thing we have on the schedule is lunch. So, so I would like to thank you all for coming, and for those online, thank you. And could we give some hands to the presenters?